I evolved to care a lot more about nature studies than just mycophagy, because I found the better one understands the environment, the richer one's experience with, and the deeper one's connection is to nature whenever you take a walk in the woods. Mycophagy, just in case you didn't know, is a $5 word for to eat mushrooms. While we would never want to do anything to inhibit the conversation about mycophagy, we here at MAWDC do feel like we can be about more than just that. And it gives me great pleasure to see that our club has slowly been shifting some of our paradigm in recent years to more non-mycophagy themes, especially regarding forest ecology and fungi's central role within it, and in particular, expanding our dialogue regarding conservation and preservation. I, like many of you, consider myself a nature lover first and foremost, who just happens to have an acute interest in kingdom fungi. Thus, that said, you'll find tonight's talks are less mushroom-centric than other monthly meetings, but a good example of some of the conservation and preservation themes that we're hoping to use our platform to promote moving forward. So one day, someday, I hope the most asked question on a foray changes from, can you eat it, to what is it? April is traditionally the beginning of morel season, as we just heard from Mitch. And for many years, that conversation dominated our April meeting. But April is also Earth Month, and Earth Day is on the 22nd, a day in which we celebrate Mother Earth, exactly 1 week after Tax Day, a day in which we collectively and silently curse the IRS. The month of April, in other words, presents a perfect opportunity to spend some time discussing conservation and preservation of Mother Earth. And that is the overarching theme of both of tonight's talks. In my portion, we're going to learn a little bit about the person who almost single-handedly is responsible for the modern environmental movement. And in the next talk, my good friend, Judy Jacob, is going to discuss some best practices for preserving our cultural heritage sites. So let's begin. Rachel Louise Carson, let me turn on my pen before I forget. Rachel Louise Carson was born in Springdale, Pennsylvania on May 27th, 1907. She was the third child of Robert and Maria Carson, and as can be witnessed in this slide title, she was from the very beginning her mother's child. Her childhood home is located just north of Pittsburgh along the banks of the Allegheny River, an area in her time that was still heavily forested with some agriculture and light industry providing most of the employment opportunities. Her father, Robert, while a very well-meaning man, never provided more than a meager existence for his family. And the Carsons' home lacked both central heating and running water for all of the 29 years that they would reside there. Rachel, being several years younger than her siblings, had mostly a solitary existence during her formative years, a time that would serve her well for the force of nature that she would become one day. She favored the companionship of books and was fascinated by nature from the very beginning, traits that were completely lacking in her two older siblings. She favored her mother in that way, who was a teacher by training, but had given up her career for the demands of marriage, motherhood, and running the household. Yet her passion for education endured, and she found in Rachel a common bond for all the things that she held dear: a love of literature and nature studies. She saw in Rachel the embodiment of all of her unfulfilled ambitions in life and was determined to provide her youngest and brightest child with the tools to professional success that had eluded her. Maria Carson, Rachel's mother, was a no-nonsense woman of stern Presbyterian stock, as you might guess from that photo, with a deep affection for the natural world. And she would make the forest surrounding their home, Rachel's first classroom. And they would spend countless afternoons walking in the woods together and learning about the local flora and fauna. As I said, Rachel was always partial to the companionship of books, but she wasn't content to just read other people's work. And by the young age of just 10, she published her first short story in a children's magazine. And by the age of 14, she was regularly submitting pieces for sale. In other words, in her own words, she much later would say, I can remember no time, even in the earliest childhood, when I didn't assume I was going to be a writer. Also, I can remember no time when I wasn't interested in the out of doors and the whole world of nature. Those interests I know I inherited from my mother, and I have always shared with her. Rachel was always a serious student and the top pupil in her class. So whenever she was awarded a scholarship to the Pennsylvania College of Women in Pittsburgh, her mother went on to sell many household items, including the family china, to help cover expenses. And then her mother would frequently, most weekends, make the 30-mile round trip to visit and stay with her on campus. And this continued throughout all of her undergraduate years. It would come as a shock to everyone during Rachel's undergraduate studies that she decided to change her life path and study biology instead of English literature. She had always had a clear sense of identity as someone whose sole desire was to become a professional writer. But after taking coursework in biology, the science of life struck a chord in her that she previously didn't know was there. She was still a young woman, though, and by studying the life sciences, she developed the grammar and voice that would provide the literary success later that she so often dreamed of in her formative years. But I'm getting slightly ahead of myself. After graduating at the top of her class, Rachel was admitted to Johns Hopkins to pursue a doctoral degree. But her family's financial hardships had forced her parents, her sisters, and her two nieces to move in with her in Baltimore. This was a difficult time for reasons we'll go into more depth about in a minute. But it was also when Rachel had a life-changing moment. 2 years into her graduate studies at Hopkins, she was awarded a research post in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. And for the first time in her life, she laid eyes upon the ocean. And she was moved beyond belief by the endless sea and the interconnectedness of life within it. Had it not been for the economic depression and her family's dire financial straits, she would have become a marine biologist, and thus this story would have come to an abrupt end. But fate would have another turn for the worse for our heroine, because before she could finish her doctorate studies, both her father and her sister would pass away, leaving Rachel responsible for the care of her mother and two nieces. Rachel was forced to leave Hopkins with only her master's degree and take a position at the Bureau of Fisheries, writing about conservation work. And this would be a turning point. And she was able for the first time to merge her two passions, writing and the life sciences. And thus she became a science writer and had finally found something to write about. After independently publishing a piece in the Atlantic magazine, Simon & Schuster took note of her work and offered her an advance to write a book about the ocean. And thus, after 3 years of work, during late evenings and weekends, Rachel completed her first book titled Under the Sea Wind. It was a literary triptych, a fictional tale about three sea creatures. And although she had hoped it would allow her to become a full-time writer, fate would not yet permit this dream to be realized. Despite a positive reception, within a few weeks of its release, the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, and the nation's attention had shifted from the war effort, and Under the Sea Wind sold only 2,000 copies. Rachel's life would remain unchanged for several more years, a would-be writer who could not afford the time for creative work. And through the end of the war and beyond, she could not see nor find a way forward until. Oh, by the way, this is a sculpture in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, in her honor. In the post-war New World Order, there was a shift in the public perception and a general mentality that modern science, especially chemistry, could be leveraged to control the natural world. And public enemy number one was the mosquito, along with other biting insects, because infectious diseases like malaria and typhus were persistent problems, especially in the warmer southern states. DDT was called a miracle pesticide, and in our hubris, we thought we were the apex species capable of controlling the natural world via our chemical ingenuity. We foolishly thought, we could improve nature by the liberal use of synthetic pesticides. Government agencies promoted their widespread use, and as agricultural outputs soared and public health appeared to benefit from fewer infectious diseases, few stopped to consider the consequences within the natural world from long-term exposure. To quote one high-ranking government official at the time, "We have the tools, the technology, and this is our time." But now we'll get back to Rachel's story. After 5 years at her federal job, Rachel had access to all of the confidential information regarding oceanic studies accumulated during the World War II years, accumulated because submarine warfare. And she was moved by what she found to begin working. She was so moved by what she found, she began working on another novel about the intricate web of life found within the sea. She wanted to become, in short, the ocean's biographer. And she was well equipped for this job, as Rachel was a master synthesizer of complex technical data and repackaging it for the layperson. Translating technical writing into something for mass appeal while staying true to the science is a painstaking task, and one which Rachel performed late into the night, night after night, for years after her full-time job. She was also a perfectionist, like all of the best writers, and like all of the best writers, she suffered enormously for her craft. Undaunted, though, she labored for years in solitude, perfecting her prose, and when she finally had a working manuscript, it was rejected by no less than 15 publishers before she finally found a receptive audience. It was worth it, though, in the end, because this was the turning point, and her new novel, The Sea Around Us, published in 1951, changed her life immeasurably for the better. While her first book, Under the Sea Wind, was undone by Pearl Harbor, the second book, The Sea Around Us, was aided by the steady beat of the war drum. By 1951, the Soviets had tested a nuclear bomb, and the public was desperately in need of a Cold War distraction. And The Sea Around Us was just that. It was a book about the infinite variety of interconnected life under the sea, all of which are oblivious and wholly unmoved by silly political conflict amongst human civilizations. The Sea Around Us would become and remain the top nonfiction bestseller for 32 consecutive weeks, along with the reissuing of her first book that likewise climbed to the top of the bestseller list. New York Times said that having two nonfiction bestsellers at the same time was as rare as a total solar eclipse. And I just had to add that quote in here because we're only a few days away from a total solar eclipse. Now, back to Rachel's success story. At the age of 44, Rachel now had two best-selling books about science and had at long last arrived. Unfortunately, not all regard science equally. While some people, like Rachel, find science as something beautiful and creative, others regard science as a means to an end, a means to destroy, and her success was set against the backdrop of the Cold War and the prospect of thermonuclear war. Science, and by extension the laboratory, was a means to wage war against the natural world too, to shape it in a fashion to better serve us, to wage war on pests, to wage war on nature itself. Rachel saw that human arrogance had outpaced our empathy and humanity towards nature, and thus seeking more solitude, she used revenue from her literary success to acquire property on the coastline in central Maine, where the strong tides, these are the strongest tides on the eastern seaboard, provided an abundant intertidal zone where she could study sea life. She identified with the power of life at the edge of the sea. Starfish, mussels, sea urchins, periwinkles were all visible within a short walk from her cottage in Maine, and she was profoundly happy while staying at her secluded place along the coastline. Rachel, as mentioned before, was always partial to books and closely safeguarded her solitude. This was her natural state. She was strongly introverted, but in her new cottage, she would become friends with her neighbors, Dorothy and Stanley Freeman. And they, especially Dorothy, became kindred spirits. Rachel had become increasingly estranged from her own family because of the many demands it placed on her. Even her relationship with her beloved mother, Maria, always the most important person in her life, had begun to fray. Now that Rachel had become successful, the increasing demands on her time meant she had less time for family life, and her mother, in a way, resented her because of it. Seeking refuge from public demands, as well as the strained family connections, Rachel spent increasing amounts of time at her cottage in Maine and in the company of her older neighbor, Dorothy Freeman. Rachel, in her lifetime, was never married, never involved with anyone romantically, and probably never even went on a date. Simply wasn't interested. So when I say she had a deep and caring relationship with her neighbor Dorothy, it was platonic, but profoundly deep and mutual, which was likely aided by Dorothy and her husband Stanley's deep love of nature and Rachel's books. In Dorothy, Rachel had found her greatest friend and confidant. She had found her soulmate. When she published her third book about the ocean, The Edge of the Sea, in 1955, it was dedicated to Dorothy and Stanley Freeman, not to her mother, as she had in her previous two books. Despite the many demands they put on her, her loyalty to her family, however, was unwavering. And now that she'd finally achieved the literary success she'd always dreamed of, enough to resign from her post from the Fish and Game Commission to dedicate her life to writing, her niece Marjorie died of pneumonia, and Rachel had to become the adoptive parent to Marjorie's son. Being a parent was a role she never sought out nor desired, but knew the time demands exceeded what she was willing to sacrifice. But now, at the height of her fame, she could no longer dedicate the long hours that good writing requires, and her career languished. That is, until DDT, dare I say the chemical name, dichlorodiphenotrichloroethene, is a synthetic molecule that was first synthesized in 1874. And absolutely nobody cared at all because nobody had any idea whatsoever what it might be good for until 1939, when a Swiss chemist, Paul Muller, discovered it was a powerful insecticide that exerts its effects apparently on the nervous system. DDT was called a miracle pesticide, and it was liberally used during the war years to combat infectious diseases in tropical and subtropical locations to great effect. DDT is, without doubt, an extremely effective insecticide. During the campaign in Italy in World War II, an epidemic of typhus broke out in Sicily, and given that typhus is spread by lice, the military was able to solve the epidemic by liberally sprinkling, as you can see here, DDT on the native Sicilian population to delouse them. In another example, General MacArthur often complained about the devastating effect of malaria on his fighting capacity in the tropical heat of the Pacific Theater. But liberal application of the miracle pesticide made malaria a non-issue well before the end of the war. In our hubris, we thought we were the apex species and capable of controlling the natural world via our chemical ingenuity. We thought, foolishly believed, that we could improve nature by the liberal use of pesticides. This thinking is just so misguided to my mind, it almost feels like an abstraction. We don't even yet understand nature, not in full anyhow, and we never will. That's what makes nature study so infinitely fascinating. And we'll certainly never control it, not in full, and nor should we even try. Cheap and long-lasting, DDT was rushed into widespread use practically overnight. And by 1951, malaria had been effectively eliminated from the United States. Governmental agencies promoted this widespread use, and as agricultural output soared and public health benefited with fewer infectious diseases, few stopped to consider the consequences and within the natural world and human physiology from long-term exposure. DDT was a magic bullet, and spurred by his success, other synthetic pesticides were rushed onto the market. And like DDT, no rigorous testing of long-term effects. Better living through chemistry, or in the words of one of my favorite authors, Kurt Vonnegut. So it goes. By the 1960s, DDT and other synthetic pesticides were ubiquitous, and by example, you could buy paint impregnated with DDT, shelf liners where you store your food were impregnated with DDT. There was even a DDT fumigator that attached to the muffler on your riding lawnmower, so you could better volatilize that pesticide while you cruised about the yard. That way, whenever your friends came over later for a barbecue, they wouldn't have to suffer any mosquito bites. There were virtually no limitations placed on the application of synthetic pesticides, despite unignorable fish and bird kills from its overuse. The dangers of the liberal use of pesticides had first come to Rachel's attention years earlier while still employed at the Fish and Game Commission, but when she was unable to convince Reader's Digest to publish an article about it, she set the topic aside, presumably for good. But now that her Sea trilogy was complete and she was in need of a new project, a new government-sponsored effort to eradicate fire ants with the liberal use of pesticides, the overuse of pesticides, brought the topic of DDT roaring back into her consciousness. Combing through scientific research, it soon became clear to her that acute toxicity of DDT was amplified as you moved up the food chain. By example, earthworms were still sufficiently toxic a year after being exposed to DDT that they killed the robins that fed upon them. Rachel, however, was not against the judicious use of pesticides, but rather the indiscriminate use of them. And while she had serious misgivings about writing a book about their abuse and the backlash she'd suffer from industry and political circles that supported the industry, simply couldn't turn away from the systematic destruction of the natural order. Couldn't turn away from destiny in the form of one of the most important books ever written. Silent Spring is a work that shifted our collective paradigm about the natural world. Its release would spark the modern environmental movement. While writing Silent Spring, Rachel was waging war on another front as well, against breast cancer, which had led to a complete mastectomy and months of excruciating radiation treatments. I personally can hardly fathom how she found the strength to endure, yet managed to continue to work in earnest. 1 year after her initial diagnosis, she was unable to walk and could barely stand on her own. But as soon as the radiation treatment stopped and her cancer was in remission, she went back to work in a race against time. She understood this was a temporary reprieve, and thus Silent Spring was completed in early 1962, a fictional tale about the zealous quest of mastery over nature, for synthetic pesticides had been used zealously, needlessly, indiscriminately, and heedlessly, upsetting the natural balance and putting all life at risk. Public reaction was immediate and massive. Success followed. Yet, as predicted, the industry and governmental reaction were first denial and public campaigns to discredit her work. Ultimately, didn't matter. For the power of her prose was so convincing, it swayed public opinion and sparked the modern environmental movement. It was then, having finally achieved everything she'd ever dreamed of across decades of sacrifice, labor, and toil, she found out the cancer had metastasized and spread throughout the rest of her body. Suffering through the ravages of cancer, Rachel endured a select few public interviews, including a testimony in the Senate subcommittee to defend her work before returning to her beloved cottage on the coast of Maine for one last summer. She passed away the following April in 1964. Her friend and neighbor in Maine, Dorothy Greenberg, spread some of her ashes in the nearby sea that she loved so very much, thus bringing a sort of symmetry to her life in the vast ocean, which had so long captivated her every thought. The end. And maybe it's a start too. Let's see. Everybody still there?
So did you talk about what her connection is to the DC area? And
Yeah.
about the upcoming museum?
Yeah. So I think I'm still sharing my screen. I believe I am. So on this final page, I wanted to just illuminate some of the different reference material I looked at and some the other resources you might want to check out if you want to take a little bit deeper dive into Rachel Carson. So first up, over here in the top left, this is Linda Lear. She's actually a local treasure. She, at least the last I heard, she resided in Bethesda. And she wrote the definitive biography on Beatrix Potter. That was a talk that I did a few months ago. And as well, what I believe is the definitive biography on Rachel Carson. And so if you want to learn more about either of those two extraordinary women, that's a good place to start. And then going up here, we'll work in a clockwise direction. This was a book that I intended to read before I did this presentation, but overcome by events. This is the Silent Spring Revolution. This by Douglas Brinkley. I think he's a professor of history at the University of Arkansas, and I read one of his other books, and so I'll get to this soon. Up here in the top is the signature for the Spring Song Museum. This is a museum that dedicated to Rachel Carson that they are planning to build in Silver Spring. It's going to be very close to the Trader Joe's on Colesville Road. What I'm hoping to coordinate, details to follow, is to get somebody that's associated with that effort to come out and join us on a walk there. That's a really nice section of woods right on the fall line. And so they can tell us about the future museum. And of course, we'll talk about any mushrooms or lichens we see while there. Right below it, this is the Rachel Carson Trail. This is north of Pittsburgh. That's a 46-mile trail. And one of the attractive features about it is it goes right past Rachel's childhood homestead in Springdale, which is now a place on the national list of historic places. Down here in the lower right, Rachel Carson is interred in Park Lawn Cemetery in Rockville. Natalie Howe, who's a professional lichenologist in the club, and I go and do cemetery walks on lichens occasionally. So we just may add one of these to our list someday. That would be really nice to go visit Rachel. Over here in this section, this is Rachel Carson Park. This is in northern Montgomery County. We are definitely going to have a walk there in the not too distant future. And there is also a Rachel Carson Greenway that more or less connects this park all the way down to the future Spring Song Museum, I believe. And to finish down here, you get to downtown Pittsburgh. You get a chance to drive across the Rachel Carson Bridge. Pittsburgh has an enormous number of bridges, and very nice to see that one of them is named after Rachel Carson. Okay, stop sharing now.
Tom, that was just terrific. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. I hope other folks